Hello, my name is Joshua Moran, and I wanted to talk with you about 1 John 3:16 through 18, and we'll be reading from the English Standard Version. I'm titling today's teaching, Love is an Action, Not a Feeling. The word love is powerful, but the world around us sees it differently than what the Bible tells us about love. The word love is easy to use in conversation, easy to write on paper, but difficult to accomplish. Jesus showed us the ultimate example of love. 1 John 3:16 through 18 reads this: "By this we know love, that he laid down his life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for the brothers. But if anyone has the world's goods and sees his brother in need, yet closes his heart against him, how does God's love abide in him? Little children, let us not love in word or talk, but in deed and in truth." The Apostle John is writing to an audience of believers who would have heard from false teachers in the day that denied the divinity of Christ and the humanity of Jesus, basically saying Jesus isn't God. He was just a great man. And John is going back to the basics of Christianity in this letter, and he wants to shore up the doubters. He wants to shore up those believers who may have doubts about who Jesus is and what this Christian life is all about. And so as a believer, we're to love by our actions, not just with our words. That's what John is saying here. In fact, words themselves are rather empty. Love is difficult. It's an action. It's not a feeling. And so the Apostle John sets up the verse here, verse 16, with a reference to Jesus' teaching about anger and hate in Matthew 5:21 to 22. The Beatitudes. See, in verse 15, you got to read right before and you got to read right after this passage to get an understanding. And so in Matthew 5:21 to 22, Jesus begins to refer to how anger and hate will basically send you to fiery pits of hell. And so what does Jesus mean by this? And so when we hate a brother, it's as if we've committed murder. He goes on to say things like, if we look upon a woman with lust, we have already committed adultery. Jesus is turning the Judaism of its day on its head. The very teachings, the very legalism they lived by, he said, no, listen, the law is even more than that. It's this. This is the heart of God, and this is what it means to live for God. And so Jesus turned all of it on its head. In fact, his opposite understanding baffled the teachers. And so here in 1 John, we see that John is going back to the basics of what Jesus was really implying about the word love. And so doubters in those days, false teachers, would begin to teach other things because it just didn't make sense. See, the gospel is foolishness to those who don't believe. And so John was like, listen, love is this simple. Love stares right into the face of selfishness. It is the opposite of the very need we can feel to protect ourselves in moments of fear or even laziness. And John emphasizes that love should abide in every believer. So we learn that the believer, one, loves with his or her life and loves by meeting the needs of others. It is by sacrifice and charity that the love of a believer is exemplified. And so laying down your life, what does that mean? Jesus was the ultimate example of God's love. We read from the Apostle Paul in Romans 5:8, but God shows his love for us in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. That is the ultimate example of love. It's the very love that John referred to in verse 16. And so, of course, Christian history is full of stories about those who lost their lives for the gospel. However, losing your life for the sake of another is completely different. You give it all in order for another to live on. I think of the soldiers who go into battle for our freedom and liberty, but it is the moment in the foxhole where true love is displayed. I think of the story of Abraham and how his promised son Isaac and a gift and an answer from God. Abraham was to sacrifice. He was asked to sacrifice his own son on the altar to God. And while this may seem harsh in today's day, nobody's going to the altar and killing their children, at least publicly. And unbelievable. it's an unbelievable example, and yet with the culture of its day, this is a norm. And so it was God's test of love. His willingness to love God in this moment was exemplified at the altar with a knife raised in the air. And what I mean by norm, I don't mean that everybody was killing their children on altars, but pagan religions everywhere were used to sacrificial systems and all kinds of evil going on. And so God was testing Abraham to say, do you love me? Then take your son to the altar. And he did. He prepared it. And Isaac even asked, but Father, where's the sacrifice? And he raised the knife. And amazingly, Abraham was willing to do this. It's our willingness to give our lives for someone else's benefit that God judges. It can start small in the willingness to sacrifice for our own desires, for the sake of another. But see, Abraham found a ram in a thicket. God said, wait, I saw your willingness. And so it's our willingness to lay down our lives. And sometimes it's not the literal life, giving of our own blood, but it's the giving of our sacrifice. Maybe it's something you've worked hard for, and you believe this was the right thing to do for you, and then you get in a relationship, or you have children, or whatever it is, and you have to lay down everything you worked hard for. What you call your life, you have to lay down. And number 2, meet the needs of others. Finally, John tells us that the love of God cannot abide in us if we can see a brother in need, and yet, with the very heart that God asks us to love him with, not meet the need if we are able to. And so we think of the story of the Great Samaritan, and how many people walked by the one in need, and it was a Samaritan, the lowest of the low, according to the Jew, who came by the side and picked this person up and fed them and nursed them to health and materially made sure they were cared for. And so are we willing to do that? That is the love of Jesus. That is the love that John is talking about. And so John would see this as an oxymoron of sorts. How can God's love abide in you if you do the opposite of what God's love calls for? And so when we meet the needs of others, we're fulfilling God's love for that person. We are the very extension of God's love. We are both recipients of God's love and givers of God's love. And when we withhold love, we withhold God, and we withhold who God is in us. Talk is cheap, but love is expensive. And so in this passage, we learn that our willingness to lay down our lives and meet the needs of others is the very foundation of God's love for us and others.